New also this week, Trump seeking to leverage his authority to fire top agency officials. This was out of Bloomberg, essentially saying that President Trump has asked the Supreme Court whether he can fire officials at independent agencies. And of course, in the lore of Bitcoin, there's perhaps no independent agency that holds the mind share of the Federal Reserve. And apparently, Trump either asking directly or indirectly whether he could fire Jerome Powell. Of course, Jerome Powell out today speaking about Bitcoin and crypto, kind of referencing that he thinks that the industry should come under a legal framework, that he thinks it's ready to mature, being a bit of a politician himself. But this idea now that Trump is coming to end the Fed, maybe completing the Ron Paul journey, and maybe cleaning up what you were saying, Nolan, some of this idea that these independent, kind of non-elected parts of the government really are part of the problem rather than the solution.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've been anticipating for a long time. If you remember at Bitcoin Magazine, when they were served with that cease and desist about the Fed Now stuff, and they said, that you can't copyright infringement or something like that. I remember there was the state of Missouri versus Fauci. There was versus Joe Biden, pardon me, the state of Missouri versus Joe Biden. And it was really about the ability of the federal government to tap third parties to do censorship on their behalf. So they're not allowed to censor, but they would go and get a third party, like some regulator or some NGO. They would do the censorship, and then they were able to censor that way. So that's what this was about. It was about COVID information or something like that. And so when you look at that case, when you look at this censorship apparatus and how it functioned and how that discretion and power was shared in that way, you can kind of see a lot of the arguments that we see. I know I wanted Bitcoin Magazine to enjoin that case. Now, the defense that the Federal Reserve was going to have to make was that we're not the government, and we're not, it's not the same as the Missouri thing, because it's not the government getting you to censor, it's us. And we would say, oh, so you're making the case for us that you're not the government, because it's not widely enough known that they exist in this sort of pocket away from the government. And now there's been times when that wasn't exactly the case. In World War II, I guess they were embedded inside of Treasury. But that's been the talk all week. The talk all week, if you read the Arthur Hayes piece, the BBC, the Big Besant C-O-C-K, and then the cuck chair the cuck chair that Powell had to go sit in. I've seen Powell for years now as like a hostage. Every time I hear him talk, I'm seeing someone say, like, give me hostage signals that they're having a lot of trouble doing what they're trying to do. And I think it's more so the case than ever. And this weird place the Federal Reserve exists in now, having to tell people inflation is tariffs, and even though the tariffs haven't come in, and they're not invited to any of the White House things. What we see here is a lot of what Arthur Hayes said. This is about who's in control. This is about the subordination of the Federal Reserve to the Treasury, and Treasury getting back to being the heart of the economic engine, back to being the heart of how interest rates are set in America. And this really is a fight for who's at the center of the discussion, who's actually at the center of interest in the economy. And that's what Besant is up to. And that's why the Federal Reserve is probably going to get no quarter by anyone in the administration. It looks like they're determined to put Besant and the Treasury back in the driver's seat.
Well, of course, the meta drama here is just, this is also stuff that is occurring outside the law, with Trump, essentially attempting to use the executive powers to their fullest extent. McSweeney, your thoughts on this idea that the Fed could be in the crosshairs of the president?
I mean, I think they're in the crosshairs already. I mean, what was it, a week and a half ago? Again, I think I was on vacation, so forgive for not knowing the exact day, but Trump tweeted at Powell, basically, it's a great time to cut interest rates. I think there is, and it's not just White House versus Fed, or, it's White House versus Congress. It's where does the power center within America sit now? Will the courts and Congress be subordinate to the executive? Where does the Fed fall into that? I think the Trump White House has made itself pretty widely heard. They want to be the center of power here. There's that phrase, in like conservative legal circles, like the unitary executive theory, the idea that except in specific circumstances, all power within the Constitution should flow not in just to the executive branch, but like the core of the executive branch. So when the White House is going to the Supreme Court saying, hey, all these agencies that have been created by Congress, like the Federal Reserve is authorized by Congress, like we should be able to just be able to fire these people regardless whatever the statute says. So if it's an agency where by the letter of the law it says, oh, well, you can't just dump this agency head, like Congress has to do this, Congress has to be informed, they have to be part of the process. The White House is saying, well, no, we can just do what we want and you just have to live with that. These are going to be court battles that take years to play out. Will it hit a situation where Trump and co go for the jugular and say, hey, Jerome Powell, you're out? Wouldn't be the most shocking thing to happen, but that's a big move. And I wonder who in the White House would be coaching that. I'm sure certainly, people like Pete Navarro. I wonder if like Bessent would be one calling for Powell's head necessarily.
Well, no, Bessent and Powell still meet weekly, right? So they do still have what I understand to be a cordial relationship, and they get along. So
I would suspect if there was a Oval Office meeting about, well, should Powell get the guillotine, I suspect that Bessent would be saying no. I think if they were to just one day, in the morning say, hey, Powell's no longer part of the team, there would be a reaction in the market, certainly similar to what we saw, in the last week where the upending of global trade norms resulted in the freak out of the markets that we saw. I suspect that there would be a similar reaction to Powell getting the boot. But again, this isn't just about the Fed. It's about where is the power center. There are certainly people, the further rightward you lean, who don't think that democracy functions as well as it should, and that perhaps new models are necessary. I do see some of these power struggles within the context of that. Not saying that they're trying to turn Trump into a king, but I think they're certainly looking at monarchy as like for some lessons there in the context of how power is distributed, who has the authority within a government system. And yeah, certainly the crosshairs are on the Fed with respect to the impact on the economy they have. As Nolan said, their ability to set interest rates and probably the perceived threat to the authority of the White House is something I imagine they're taking seriously. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the year, there is some major confrontation between the White House and the Fed, whether it's like they say, hey, Powell, we want you out, and that becomes its own Supreme Court fight, whether they go to Congress and they say, hey, we want you to revise the Federal Reserve Act, we want to see these changes. What does that fight turn into? Something is going to happen. Maybe it falls somewhere in between, but like I suspect it's either going to be a move on the statutory side, or as kind of the incitement of this conversation, like a move on the personnel side.
Yeah.
Well, of course, all great reasons to own Bitcoin. Just thinking about this, if my money was hostage to this system, just how truly frightening that would be.
Doesn't bode well for the dollar either way.
No, that's just it. Is that no matter what Trump wants to print, he's got to keep interest rates low, and every piece of logic flows through that.